Hey everyone, this is Eric at Flyin Miata. Welcome to another issue episode or part of a series of FM Live. Today we're going to be talking about some brake stuff. In particular, I want to talk about the basics. So how to maintain your brakes, how to inspect your brakes, what to look for, some lifespan expectancy, stuff like that. But I also wanted to point out that we got a ton of really good questions from social media, Facebook, Instagram, asking us about brake kits and brake theory. How do master cylinders work? How do rotor diameters work? So on and so forth. So that's a huge topic, and I think we'll probably end up doing another video about theory and about brake kits. But today I'm just going to cover really the basics, get things started. I know a lot of folks are getting their Miatas out from winter hibernation, getting them ready for the road, getting them ready for the track. Typical Miata behavior. So without further ado, let's get started. So you can see I've got lots of goodies out here on the table. Gave myself a few talking points. So to really get down to basics, the big question is, what is the primary function of your brakes? And of course, yes, it is to slow and stop the vehicle, but it's also doing some other stuff. So it's converting that kinetic energy into heat, and then the heat needs to be dissipated, and your brake system needs to be able to do that over and over and over again. And the poorer condition your brake system is in, the less and less it's able to do that. So keeping that heat dissipation in mind, let's go ahead and get started on some parts. So rummaged around the shop and found some brake pads in various condition. So let's look at these guys first. These are a very aggressive racing pad. This one's new, and it's got a lot of metallic in it, so it's very abrasive. So not great for driving around the street. You need them to be hot in order for them to work properly. If you drove around on these on a streetcar, they wouldn't develop enough heat in them to be effective, and the abrasiveness would actually eat away your rotors very quickly. So this one's used. It's the same pad compound, but when you take a look at it, you can see quite a bit of it is worn away. And on initial glance, it's hard to tell, but when you look at these channels here, you can see how much deeper this one is than this one. So you can kind of tell how much pad material is gone. So how far should you let these go before it's really time to change them? Well, probably the lowest you'd want to let these go is if the pad material is starting to be about the same thickness as the backing plate. Then you want to seriously consider adding new pads to your system. The reason being is, going back to heat dissipation, the pad material is actually the part of the whole apparatus here that's responsible for dissipating that heat once you're done using the brakes. And the less of it you have, the faster the pad is going to wear away, and the less effective it's going to be at dissipating that heat. So once they get to a certain point, for safety, really, you really want to think about putting new pads in. So as a couple other examples, and to take note of one of the questions we got from social media, this pad is a good example. So I don't know if you can see that, but it's actually more worn out at the top than it is at the bottom. It's actually a wedge shape when you look at it carefully. So what in the world causes that? Well, if we come down here and look at this caliper, this is a stock caliper. It happens to be from an ND Miata. So you can see here's the bracket, and here's the caliper itself with the piston in it, and you can see here's the slide pins. So the caliper can move on the bracket via the slide pins when you're actually engaging the brakes. So if there's damage to these guys, or damage to the bracket, or one of these slide pins is sticking because it's lost its lubrication somehow, it's going to change the angle at which these two things push the pads against the rotor, and you're going to start getting wonky, uneven brake pad wear. So one of the symptoms that somebody asked about was my inside pad is wearing faster than my outside pad. So that may be that the slide pins are sticking, or in really old Miatas, they may be rusted. They may have become one piece of metal. And in that case, the only pad that's getting pressed against the rotor is going to be the one that's behind the piston. Okay, so as we're going along here, I'll look over to Kyle and make sure there aren't any questions that pop up. But if you're watching this after we've already published it, if you've got any questions about what I'm going through, feel free to shoot us an email, give us a call, post your question in the comments below, so on and so forth. You know the drill. So let's move on to rotors. So I dug up these guys out of our metal dumpster out back. That's why they're all rusty. But I cleaned up parts of them with a little Scotch-Brite pad. And what I'm trying to point out is these things have had the crap kicked out of them on the track. And so you can see all these black spots. Those are heat spots. Those are where the rotor was overheated and perhaps almost became just a little bit molten. And you can't, this is not feel-o-vision, but you can actually feel how wavy this is as a result. So could you clean this up? Could you reuse this rotor? Probably not. In fact, pretty close to no. If this was a standard rotor, not a two-piece, and you took it to Napa or wherever to have them turn this, they wouldn't be able to turn it because the black spots are harder than the gray spots. And it would either damage their machine or take big chunks of metal out of this rotor. So it's essentially no good anymore. So what would happen if this rotor started to crack? You actually could see heat checking, kind of looks like a checkerboard pattern, and it may actually have little flakes of metal coming off of it, or actually, in severe cases, you'll actually see a rotor crack like this way. So that could be problematic because it all of a sudden makes your rotor a lot more abrasive than it was, and it'll take out your brake pads pretty quickly, or vice versa. So this is one that's been used on an employee's car. It's still fine. It's seen some autocross, it's seen a little track, but probably 80%, 90% of its life has been spent on the street. So you can see it's pretty typical. There's not a lot of buildup in the slots. This one could be potentially resurfaced and reused again, which leads us to my final point. How do you know when to replace these things? We went over heat checking and cracks and stuff like that, but if you're just driving your car and you're not beating the crap out of your rotors too much, how do you know when to replace them? Well, on most rotors, the spec for how thin you can turn them is usually on the inside. It could be on this lip right here. It could also be stamped on the outside here. So the reason that's important, that you don't want to go thinner than that, is because this is also something that dissipates heat. Rotors are heavy for a reason. It's a big piece of metal because it can absorb a lot of heat and it can dissipate a lot of heat very quickly. So the more material you remove, the less effective it is at doing that. So you want to pay attention to that number on the rotor, the manufacturer's specification. So on slotted rotors, the general rule of thumb is that if you can no longer see the slot, or if it's basically starting to disappear, then it's done. It's time to change. So this one has nice deep slots. It's still good to go for a while. So brake fluid. So what's the service life of brake fluid? When should I flush it? When should I change it? So on and so forth. Well, let's say you just picked up that 1994 M Edition that was driven to church once a week by a little old lady and only has 20,000 miles on it, and it still has the original brake fluid in it. Well, one of the things that brake fluid does is that it's hygroscopic, which means that it absorbs moisture from the atmosphere. And the reason it does that is that it holds that moisture rather than exposing your brake parts to it, so the insides of your brake lines don't corrode. So over time, it's going to become saturated and start to corrode your parts. The other thing to think about is that you'll see a spec, usually, somewhere on a website or on the bottle itself, about dry boiling point and wet boiling point. So dry boiling point means that the fluid is fresh. It's had no opportunity to absorb moisture from the atmosphere. So that number is going to be quite a bit higher than the wet boiling point, which means it's old and has had lots of opportunity to absorb moisture from the atmosphere. So the reason that's important is because under normal braking on the street, your rotors and your brake system can approach 400, 500 degrees on a normal stop. So you want to make sure your brake fluid is up to the task. Now that gets more important for us Miata folks because we drive our cars like sports cars. We're not driving them like Chevy Tahoes and Buicks. If you've got a Chevy Tahoe or a Buick, beautiful car, keep going. So we talked about calipers, brake pad wear, fluid, rotors, and pads. So somebody had a really good question about adjusting your park brake. And on a Miata, there's kind of a few places to do that, but there's one place that is the most important. So if you'll join me over here under Kyle's car, I can show you exactly where that happens. So I'm going to point at it right here. There's actually a small 14 millimeter bolt, or the head of the bolt is 14 millimeters. And inside there's a 4 millimeter Allen screw. And that's what actually adjusts the piston for your park brake. So when you change your pads and you want to compress the piston into the caliper, you want to back that little bolt out of there first. Otherwise your piston won't come in and your pads will go in, but they won't fit over your new rotor because the piston's in the way. So that's the first thing you want to do. So you've done that, you've compressed the piston, you've put your new pads on, you put your new rotor on. How do I know how tight to get this thing for the park brake? So you want to go in with it. Basically what I normally do is get my tool and start spinning the wheel. And I tighten it down until I can start to feel some resistance. And that's about all the further you need to go. So another question that came up on social media, how do I keep my brake pads from rubbing or running against my rotor while I'm going down the road? Well, that's normal. There's nothing out of the ordinary about that. They're gonna lightly rub against the rotor going down the road. So that's why, when you get a car, your Buick or your Chevy Tahoe is gonna have plain rotors. They're smooth, so they're quiet. And then the pad material is probably gonna be a lot less metallic than those race pads, so they're quiet. Because that's what you really want out of a daily driver street car, something that you're going to take on a road trip. You don't want to hear your brake pads grinding away or the slots on your rotor going shush, 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 shush over your aggressive pads. So it's normal for the pads to be rubbing on the rotor just a little bit. So let's take a trip over to this NC and take a look at the rotor. It's kind of an interesting example. So you can see this rotor is a lot like those one-piece rotors that I was showing you over there. You can see that it's got a lot of heat scoring. It's actually, I don't know if you can see that on the camera, but it's actually reflective. It's almost got a little bit of a mirror-like quality to it. So not only has it gotten awfully hot, but it's also glazed. So glazing means that the surface has become really, really smooth. And that's not optimal for braking performance. So you want to have a little bit of texture to this thing. And when it's gone like that, because the rotor's glazed, you're compromising your braking power. This is kind of the long and short of it. So this rotor is probably serviceable, but it's also got some heat scoring on it. So if you're ever in doubt about this stuff, take it to your local shop, take it to a brake center, someplace that services brakes, maybe even a place that services racing brakes, and let them inspect your rotors and let them give you some feedback in person. Otherwise, just going to check with Kyle again. He's got his hand up, so let's see what that question is.
We've got the most common question.
Mm-hmm.
What's your opinion on slotted, drilled, and just slotted and drilled, or just slotted versus conventional rotors?
Okay. So the question is asking about rotor types. So plain rotors, slotted rotors, and slotted and or drilled rotors. So the function behind slots and drilled rotors is that under extreme braking, so racing conditions or even Miata conditions, if you want to think of it that way, is that there's actually a barrier of gas that builds up between the rotor and the brake pad. And this is kind of theory, so we can do another video that's more in depth about this. So basically what happens is that layer of gas is extremely compressible, but it also needs to be cleared away, and that's what the slots in the rotors do. They also aid in cooling and heat dissipation. In many instances, slotted rotors can be serviced. Not every place is going to want to turn those for you, but in a lot of instances, drilled rotors won't be serviceable, so they're kind of one-time use. Once they're spent, you got to have a new set. So that's kind of that in a nutshell. But we can cover that more in another episode where we talk more about theory and brake kits and stuff like that. What else do we got?
That's it for questions.
Okay. Well, I think I've been talking at you quite a while. So once again, I really appreciate everybody that submitted questions for this video. It's encouraged us, and obviously we should do another video about braking theories and all kinds of the brake kits that we carry. We'd love to do that, and we'll bring that to you soon. Otherwise, if you have been, thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you next week at 2 o'clock on Thursday, Mountain Time, for another FM Live. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.